Javier Rivera, how we go? Real, I like it. Lacan. All right,
Yeah.
Javier, I've been really enjoying Julie Reschi. I think she's getting at some important stuff. So we're going to start with you just telling me, who is Julie Reschi? Why do you like her thinking? And what have you gotten from the book?
Um, man, you're going straight for the gut.
Yeah, I know, right? Go for it. I'm
Um,
fascinated.
Honestly, I'm fascinated too. I mean, really, the thing that sparked my interest is when Cadell shared her discussion video, with her talking with Todd McGowan, Catherine Malibu, and Alenka Supančić. Um, yeah, I mean, I think what attracted my thought from her is I mean, I think right now her aim critique is against positive psychology.
Right.
So I think her borrowing from Philip Reef is very important. You know, this idea of we're now in this era of psychologized beings, which is true, I think. And then I think the other thing that interests me about her is the fact that she wants to centralize the death drive
Right.
and how she seems to talk about the inadequacy of centralizing the death drive. And why is there an inadequacy to centralize the death drive? Why is there a tendency to sort of every time we want to, we end up taking two steps backwards? Um, and so I think this challenge is sort of very interesting. And I think that's what attracted my thought. And also what attracted me is that, you know, it's made me very, very uncomfortable. Her thinking
Sure.
has made me relatively uncomfortable, because it's not, it's relatively counterintuitive to the way I've previously have thought.
Right.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, is that
No, that's great. I mean, the moment you mentioned Philip Reef, I mean, his whole thing is we live in a therapeutic age, and ironically, when you're overly therapeutic, it actually destroys the civilization. There's a lot of things here that are very interesting to me. So first off, if we think Protestant Kierkegaard, as I mentioned to you, Kierkegaard's whole thing is that Christianity becomes Christendom when it becomes too therapeutic, right? And he has this real emphasis on irony. And to me, I've always really associated the death drive with a kind of irony drive. I always talk about irony as the fabric of reality. You think X will make you happy, and that's why it doesn't. Human beings are constantly engaged in self-deception. They do things they think are good, and it ends up being bad. You think if you do this, you'll be happy, and it is not. And I don't actually think, as we've talked about before, from Michelle and I, like, you really have to see irony as somehow basically ontological. Like, it is as deep as it gets. And I feel like when she's saying the death drive needs to be central, she's talking about something like that. Now, I
Mhm.
do think there's a debate on, is there really a subconscious desire to die? Or is there something about rationality that we have no idea what it is? We have no idea how our mind works, and we constantly end up undermining ourselves when we don't mean to. There's almost like, I think at this stage in the game, these really subtle distinctions are everything, right? And it's really, really
Yeah.
tricky. And
Mhm.
like, so for example, in Kafka, it's kind of funny because characters do what they think is good for them and they destroy themselves, right? Like there's a kind of comedy that's at play. Hey, Michelle, we're talking about great, subtle distinctions. So in Kafka, there's this idea that characters do, like Joseph K does what he thinks is going to free him from prison, and that's particularly what ends up in his execution, right? But did
Mhm.
Joseph K want to die? Like, does he have a subconscious desire to die? Maybe, maybe not. Kafka would almost say there's something about humans that is hilarious. Like they do what thinks what's good for them and they end up undermining themselves, right? So I think there are some questions on, is it a death drive? Is it the nature of reality is ironic because rationality can't understand itself? But regardless what we think, because then in Christianity, right, like humans are fallen. Like the big thing that Protestants like really, really emphasize through Calvin is Christians don't really believe they're fallen anymore. Like to the point where it's really, really bad. Like if you really, and
Mhm.
Michelle and I talk about this a lot, like if you really,
Mhm.
really take sin seriously, that changes everything. And most of the time we don't. People treat sin like a moral thing, not an
Mhm.
ontological thing. And so for me, what Julie Resch is getting at is really, really hitting on that. Like this idea that we are really not taking seriously the depths of the problem. And this is what I wonder. So this is like basically the question for me. What is
Mhm.
psychoanalysis then? Like, what is it? If it's not a therapy, if it's not a making you feel better, then what exactly does it do? We can ask the same thing about sermons. Like, what is reading the
Yeah.
Bible? Like, what is reading about Job? What are you doing? Are you feeling better? Are you like, what are you doing? Like, if you're sin, if you're fallen, if you can't do anything. Now, in the
Mhm.
Bible, you'd say, well, you're learning about hope and salvation and stuff, right? Well, then that leads us into the bad religion that Nietzsche's critiquing, right? So, what
Yeah.
is psychoanalysis then? that takes seriously the death drive. I feel like it comes on that. What are your thoughts to that?
Yeah, so I think Julie Resch is trying to point out that relations can only exist in a sort of negative fashion. That our relations fundamentally are there's this paradox, you could say irony, where we can only communally relate to each other simultaneously once we feel alienated.
Right.
Right. And so there is something about this radical openness of the negativity that is there, or that is there in the death drive, that if we're sort of open to it in a sort of vulnerable fashion, that causes us to have relations and community and so on. And I think that's what Julie Resch is trying to get at, because she does talk about forgiveness. She does talk about sacrifice. These are very pivotal elements in her thinking about a kind of dying towards death. Now, what's interesting is that I wonder if the conversation got obscured with positive psychology, where we started focusing too much on pleasure and suffering versus death, which I think is completely different. And I think maybe that's the distinction that she wants to refocus again, where it's no longer this dialectics between pleasure and suffering, but more like death. How do we deal with the fact that death is sort of the inevitable outcome anyways? And I think that's some of the conversation. So yeah, when we talk about psychoanalysis, she likes psychoanalysis mainly because it is a failure. But she thinks this failure is necessary because you can look at the failure, and I think you talked about this before with me on Twitter, about maybe it's this kind of like radical openness, right? The failure sort of is this radical openness. And I think that's what psychoanalysis should remain for her. And I think the death drive functions as a way to maintain that radical openness.
Right.
And I think if we're not faithful to that radical openness, I think that's when effacement arises. Right. We start perceiving the enemy as some external thing that needs to be eradicated, and so on. And so I think that's how I would place her thinking in that sense.
Yeah, and when I read her, what I guess I've started doing with the emphasis on like positive versus negative, I just replace the word positive with therapeutic, because I think that gets kind of closer at what she's getting at. Like there is clearly some positive implication. Like if I say never be positive, there's no good from this at all. Well, obviously she ends the book based on your review, kind of saying if you think you can implement it, you don't get it, right? But there's clearly something interesting going on where there's a kind of, now I do think in Hegel, the reconciliation is precisely, I can't do anything. I have to be open to the future, but I can't know I can't do anything. And that changes my disposition. Like if I know I can't save you, Javier, then I relate to you differently than if I think I can save you, right? And funny enough, the irony is when people in relationships try to save one another, what happens? They get destroyed, right? And in fact, what's better is to say, I can't save you, which then sounds like the relationship's dead, but that's actually the reconciliation with the truth for Hegel, which is I can't save you, now I'm actually open to you as the other. So there's something about taking the death drive seriously that is the prerequisite to openness. Like otherwise you're trying to change the world. You're trying to save people, right? And so for me, that is positive though, but it's not therapeutic, right? Like it just depends. This is what's tricky, is words suck. Like all words suck. All words suck. Words suck, Words suck. And they always mean things that they don't mean and do mean and blah, 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 right? And also the problem is the moment I start talking, but here's also the problem. If I say, hey, if you truly believe you're a sinner, you can be saved. Well, now it's really hard to believe you're truly a sinner because there's a hope in it. So there's some weird, how they talk about in religion, the hysteric tradition and the public tradition. Like there are some things you can't say publicly because that would change how people act. Like if you say, hey, you're truly a sinner, but that's okay because you're like a child of Christ. There's a risk there because then they don't actually hear the part about being a sinner and taking that seriously. And they end up actually becoming a Pharisee, right? So there's always this tension in religion where certain teachings cannot be fully expressed because then that impacts how people live in a manner that doesn't take the teaching seriously. So you always have the public and the hysteric, right? There's other language for this. So that seems to be a problem here as well. Like when you say we need to take the death drive seriously to be open to the other, that actually risks taking the death drive seriously, even if it's true, because then it sounds like a means to an end, right? And that arguably, frankly, is why in Christianity a dark night of the soul is necessary, because it's not until a dark night of the soul or your idols are shattered or something terrible happens that you truly believe the world is broken or sinful. You may have heard that your entire life, but you've always in the back of your mind had the but we're saved. But we're saved, but we have a community of Christians. And then something happens and now you really believe it. And it almost feels like, I'd be curious how you respond to that. It almost feels like Resh has a similar problem here, actually, of like taking the death drive seriously. But if you talk about anything positive, that threatens the seriousness which you need for the openness to the other. So there seems to almost be an hysteric public problem like you see in religions. I'd be curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw this most clearly when that interview with Todd McGowan and her, where it's like, she's like, I think you successfully talked about the death drive, but they're like, it's kind of ironic to say that, right? Because death drive is all about failure. So in some sense, you can't really successfully write about the death drive because it just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so I think that's what's funny about Julie Resh's work too, is that even though she's trying to make the death drive central, there's a way in which she consciously acknowledges that she fails. And that's what also makes it difficult. But yeah, I mean, no, you're right. There is this sort of awareness where I think it follows into like Socrates' critique in Phaedo, where it's like words just lack, no, it's not Phaedo, it's the other one. But like words don't have the wisdom. They lack the wisdom. That we no longer have the context for that wisdom when we say these words. And I think that's what's so difficult talking about the death drive, because fundamentally when we're talking about the death drive, we're lacking the context of wisdom from which it's coming from. And so it inadvertently already makes it positive, and that already makes it a danger, and then everything else. But yeah, I think the more that I read her, I would say like the positive, we can look at, I think I like your word, like you can look at the positive as therapeutic. There is a word that she uses when she's talking about Malibu's work, where it's like the positive is merely a modification of the negative.
Sure.
Which I like that, because what that reveals is that we're sort of not actually being open. If we're modifying it, we're not actually being open.
Right.
So if we look at the positive as the modification of the negative, then we understand that actually we're not being open. So how do we maintain that openness? Is by being constantly striving into contact with that death drive, making it central. Of course, we always radically fail, which also radically opens us to the death drive. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I would, yeah, I like that. I like that phrase of positive as therapeutic, and I also like the formation that she kind of puts, where it's like the modification of the negative. Positive is just merely the modification of that, because I think there is some kind of like Jungian kind of take where it's like, if you're not ready for it, it just destroys you.
Right.
And so you do kind of have to modify, right? There's a sort of helplessness in the fact that we do have to modify it, but then also that's what simultaneously makes us open to it. But I think the subtle thing that she's trying to exploit is that we believe so much in that modification that it's true. And I think that's the part that I think that she's really trying to fight against, I think, right? Where you kind of forget, yeah, like you were talking about before, you forget that we were sinful, that we're fallen. I think that's the tendency of forgetting. But yeah, you can
go. That's all excellent. I mean, if I say you're fallen, that's not fall. The word fallen is not fallenness. This is what's so difficult. And in fact, the act of speaking about fallenness subconsciously makes you feel like you're not fallen, because how can you be fallen if you know you're fallen? There's all of these like weird things that go on with the brain. And also too, when I hear death drive, I've always associated that with the ways that we ironically drive ourselves toward destruction, death, effacement without realizing it. The things we think make us happy don't. The things that we think will help our relationships don't. And for me, the death drive makes so much more sense when you associate it with the inescapability of irony. And that's what I just heard her saying over and over again in different ways, right? And in fact, if I were to as I would take her pessimism, it's the idea that we're not pessimistic enough about our inability to escape irony, right? We really, really
that would
don't
be.
believe that we can't escape it.
Mhm.
And the thing is, like, then for me, what that all means, I think the key also with psychoanalysis that I've always really stressed is the analysis part. Like, it's very difficult when we hear psychoanalysis to not metaphorically associated with therapy, like psychotherapy, counseling. What's very interesting to me about psychoanalysis is it actually seems entirely metaphorically different from therapy and counseling, but we as a culture don't even have like a box to correctly fit it in. Let me put a pin on that. Before I forget, I did want to note also about this kind of like need to feel like you failed to be open. For me, it's very similar to artists. Like artists, the greatest works are the ones that they feel like failed. Like William Faulkner always talked about The Sound and the Fury as his greatest failure. Picasso's always like, I'm failing. And there's something here where the artist who isn't willing to do the thing that they fail at never makes the masterpiece, right? There's something similar here, where the great artist or the subject of whom gets full personhood is engaged in the act that will fail, but that actually is the masterpiece. And a parallel with it is something that you see in artists, where like Wallace is like, nah, Infinite Jest, we had to cut it. It didn't have the fractal shape. And, you know, all of these great works, or you say, oh, there are parts of the Brothers Karamazov that are too digressive. Like there are failures part of it. And yet that failure is part of the masterpiece. And that means you have to be open and willing to fail, kind of metaphorically, to combine these together. So anyway, for me, when we talk about psychoanalysis, like it's very akin to literature in the sense, or philosophy too, where there's an analysis of how people act, how phenomena occur, how the world unfolds, and a certain sort of like mapping of how the world occurs. Like, so likewise in psychoanalysis, there's this, hey, there's this thing called the death drive. And let me show you all of the case studies that suggest this thing is real and you can't escape it. So there's an analysis of the human condition. And this is the question. What is the value of that analysis? And I do wonder actually if we've metaphorically got it wrong, because we think the value of that analysis is to feel better. No, the whole point of the analysis is to show you can't feel better, that's not an option on the table. I think actually psychoanalysis has basically nothing to do with therapy. It's everything to do with better decision-making. In the same way that freaking philosophy is about decision-making, not about getting the capital T truth. It's about understanding how the world operates or how you think, like the self-defense of David Hume. Like once you get that consciousness is structured by a death drive, you'll make better decisions. You may never feel better, but you like, that's the thing, like we're looking for a promise that you feel better or that you never get into mistake. That would be like saying, hey, if you go to practice, you'll always win the wrestling match. No one can guarantee that. No one can guarantee that you won't break your leg and never get to wrestle again. So I'm going to throw it back at you. I wonder if psychoanalysis has a lot more to do with a gymnasium than it does counseling. But we don't even have the category to think of it that way because we see psychotherapy, counseling, mental health, psychoanalysis. It must be one of those. But actually, I wonder if psychoanalysis is actually different in kind than say psychotherapy. Like it's not even the same field really, because it's in the business of decision-making and analysis of how the world works, as opposed to feeling better or solving your problems. It has nothing to do with that. It's not even going to, it can't even guarantee will mend your relationships if you don't get better at decision-making or awareness. It seems to have more to do with awareness, decision-making, understanding that how people actually are so you don't hold them up to unrealistic standards, but it's no therapy. In the same way, like if I were to ask you, is wrestling practice therapeutic? Is military training therapeutic? You'd kind of go, of course not. It's not, it's horrible. It's not therapeutic at all. And yet there is something improving about it. If I were to say, were you improved by your training? Was there something you got out of your training? I think you would say yes. I would say there was something out of wrestling practice, even though it sucked. But notice here, here's the issue. That shows you it's possible to have benefit without the therapy. It's not therapeutic benefit. It's a kind of strengthening. It's a kind of skill. It's a kind of discernment. Let me throw that may all be entirely wrong, but I do wonder if metaphorically we've associated psychoanalysis with counseling when it's more like a gymnasium. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, so you got I captured this glimmer that you're talking about in the interview again with Julie Resch and Todd McGowan, where Julie Resch tries to push back on Todd McGowan because he talks about beauty, and she goes, "Well, beauty's a benefit, right?" And then she's trying to discount it, but then McGowan shoots back and he goes, "Well, yeah, but I think it's the only benefit that's not actually a benefit. It's a benefit of the process." And I think that's what you're talking about with a gymnasium.
Yes.
It's a benefit of the process, not a benefit of some guarantee or
Yes.
some end. And I think if we look at Julie Resch's work like that, like she's talking about that she's fighting against benefits that have some type of end or guarantee or something, whereas I think it's hard for her to say that there's any real benefit, because the benefit that's a benefit's actually it's a process. It's
Yes.
not something that can just be captured by our thinking or language. It's the fact that we're always in this process that is the benefit. And I think that's why I started understanding that whatever is reconciliatory has to be a kind of negative or unspoken or a surprise, something that we can't anticipate, because if we could anticipate it, then we fall into that same trap of like, oh yeah, I know what I'm going to get out of this when I do this action, and therefore it already makes it positive. So it has to be something negative as a process. And so I think that's why it's so hard to talk about like, oh, well, isn't there any real benefit? Yeah, I think there is a benefit, but I think it has to be sort of like, because I've been incorporating a lot of Plato in my thinking lately, it's almost similar to like some transcendent good, because I feel like if there is really any good, it would have to be negative, wouldn't it? In some ways,
I
I don't know, but yeah.
I think you're putting your finger on the problem. Is that when I hear her critique of the therapeutic, to me it's a critique of the guarantee or the known result. And
Yes.
The issue is that basically in a neoliberal Western utilitarian zeitgeist, because that's what we all live in, even if we don't want to, the fullest reality is the end. Like where you're going. Oh, why are you reading this book? What is the job you're going to get? You're going to retire. Reality for the Western mind is the conclusion, right?
Yeah.
Under that paradigm, nothing makes sense that Resch is saying, right? Which actually then results, what that reveals is that the paradigm is wrong. That's incorrect. And in fact, life is about precisely the living. Like Wittgenstein says, death is not a thing in life, right? So if, you never actually encounter your end, and how many people retire and it's not what they thought it was. The key that we need a new category in our mind for is the improvement of the process of the living that is not a thing in life. We're looking for a improvement that is a thing in life, not a quality of life. So another way to put this is we're looking for an improvement that is quantifiable, and that doesn't exist. That's what I hear Resch saying. But there are qualitative improvements that if someone asks you to explain it to them, you can't, right? So another way to put this, if you come to be able to enjoy, let's say, beautiful music, then can you locate your ability to enjoy beautiful music in the world? Can you find the object that is your ability to enjoy beautiful music? No. But is that a qualitative change? Yes. Is it one that anyone can see? No. Is it one that has any guarantees? No, because it's possible that you never visit a concert hall, right? But to me, what we have to do is think in terms of qualitative changes in life that changes how we experience things, not a thing to be experienced. And that to me is where philosophy is now. Like we've exhausted the object philosophy, if you will, and now we're in the horizon philosophy or the hermeneutical philosophy, right? But this is the trick. This is kind of the religious hysteric knowledge mysticism thing. To truly have that change in your horizon, you really, 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 in your depths of being, have to believe that you cannot escape irony. And how is that possible? Like this, how is that possible? Like, how can someone not hear everything we've said in this net conversation and then that take away from their ability to truly believe in irony, right? This is why it seems at the end of the day in religions, it's either a mystical vision of beauty or death on the cross, like some sort of radical experience that breaks you through and changes your life, because it's almost seemingly impossible for an idea to change you without undermining itself precisely by the death drive mechanism. Like precisely the hearing of this net conversation goes into the brain and says, I believe everything that was just said, but then the death drive in the hearing of that idea makes you not fully believe that idea. Ergo, it always has to be an experience. That's, I think, the mechanism of why religions have always stressed a beautiful experience, a mystical experience, or a cross experience, because the death drive keeps the brain from truly believing in fallenness and hearing about fallenness. You can't do it. That's what I think Russ is trying to kind of point at in her work. And so and then it's kind of like, too, what I think Todd was saying with beauty. Like, once you understand that beauty is not a object, it's a hermeneutic. It's I always stress conditioning. It's all about conditioning. It's not an object. It's not a subject. It is a conditionality that changes how you. Conditionalism is all process. Like, conditionalism is all a conditioning process, fragile, evanescent. Like, basically what Russ's philosophy and thinking leaves us with is a life that is about glimpses, evanescence, process, conditions, nothing set. It's all flowing. It's all more Bergsonian or Whitehead or Hegelian. And that is what she's kind of saying, that psychoanalysis should be, and I'll give it back to you, psychoanalysis should be in service of that vision of reality, but because it is metaphorically locked in a therapy model, it is not serving a hermeneutical shift, which would then have you emphasize skills, abilities, ways of seeing, and instead it's about feeling better. Which, if you take the death drive seriously, that cannot be what psychoanalysis is teaching. That seems to be what she's saying. She seems to be saying, if you really take psychoanalysis seriously, it cannot be used the way it's being used. Ergo, it must not be taken seriously. But then for me, if you take it seriously, what that does is put you in the realm of gymnastics, like Plato. And it goes back to Plato, right? He's like, philosophy is what? The gymnasium. And this also then might suggest, and I'll give it back to you, why psychoanalysis and philosophy have come together like this, today, because it's almost like everyone's realizing philosophy must be about the gymnasium somehow. And people in psychoanalysis are like, psychoanalysis, they both actually have something to do with the gymnasium, and they have unintentionally just emergently come together because of that realization that we're dealing with process, not ends, not guarantees, not objects. We're dealing with hermeneutics and horizons. But you're only going to get that if you take the death drive seriously. And we're talking about this, and then it comes back to what we said, decision making. Is it all about choice in the end? The absolute choice? It definitely seems so. And then psychoanalysis would help you make better choices, but no guarantees. Here's the difference. Psychoanalysis makes you better at choosing, but it guarantees nothing that you choose. It doesn't guarantee an object of choice. It guarantees the choosing, the improvement of the choosing. But that's an open loop. Like, what does that mean? It can't guarantee anything. It's just the choosing. And for what? It's ultimately abyssal. Like we've said before, the absolute choice. All it can do is your improvement at something abyssal. And then, of course, what does that mean? Well, this is the great mystery. This is the apathetic subject. This is the essential lack. This is the absolute no. There's some sort of mystery here that the human is meant to be a master at abyssal choices. And the abyssal choice is not located in reality. It's not an object in reality. It's a hermeneutic of reality, which you cannot see. So what exactly is it? So it's some sort of mastering of the abyssal. I'm not sure. Let me give it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about the death drive that shows, like, we can't escape our own self-interest. And I think that's what's, like, already problematic about language. It's already problematic about thinking, is that because it's inescapable, because it's impossible to escape our self-interest. And even Plato talks about this in Phaedo, where it's like, hey, actually, you can't really know the truth because you have a body and you have pleasures and desires. So, like, you can't really know it. And so there is something about that I think from the beginning, philosophy is already connecting back again. And that's why psychoanalysis is, like, merging with philosophy, because we're understanding the importance of desire and, like, and sort of the oscillations of philosophy and the way that we think, because fundamentally it's very hard to disconnect now desire and our thinking. And I think because the death drive fundamentally always wants to undermine that self-interestedness that we have, it reveals that it's basically our innate idol breaker. If we really pay attention to it, if we're able to get close to it, it's our innate idol breaker. And that's how I look at it. And yeah, you're right. Psychoanalysis becoming therapeutic. That's funny because I remember Cadell talking to McGowan about this. He's like, are you using Lacan as a philosopher when he strictly said that all of his work was supposed to be strictly in the clinic? And McGowan's like, well, I just personally think he's just supposed to be a philosopher. I don't think that should have ever been something just refined to the clinic. And so there is something really to that McGowan is finding and that Reshi is finding too, where it's like we can't this idea of benefit, it seems it's strictly a kind of self-interestedness of like, oh, I can get something. I can earn salvation. And ironically, earning salvation means destroying others in a kind of weird way, right? You want to destroy others for your vision of salvation when, in fact, probably the more ironic way was there is no vision of salvation, but the fact that the beauty is in the process of the fact that there is no salvation, which ironically saves us, right? Um, or maybe you take the Lutheran the proposal, right? We're already saved, so to speak. But it's not enough just to believe that you're saved, right? You have to go through this process of dying to actually understand what it means. And so I really like this idea of living dead, living figures of death, because it does kind of show like, yeah, it is a process. It is fundamentally about dying. And I think the Christian religion perfectly resembles that, right? Like it's fun, like it's such a I think if you place Reshi like when Christ was on the cross, he's like, God, why did you forsake me? That's such a like, why is he pessimistic about that at that moment? Because he like, shouldn't you kind of know that he's gonna save him? Why does he say that? And I think that's such an important point to make because it's like in that moment on being crucified, God wasn't even sure that he was going to be saved. He was like, "Why have you left me like this?" And I think there is something to that. That there is no guarantee, and that I think living like that, living in that kind of dying way of like, "Why have I been forsaken?" shows that sort of inescapableness that we have been forsaken, right? But this is also what ironically saves us, right? And so, yeah, but of course the saving can't be like you said, right? We can't actually think that we're saving anybody when we do this. It has to be like a real antagonism of like, oh my God, I don't think I can save you, And that's ironically what makes us relate to each other. And I think that's what Reshi wants to put. But you're right. This question of like the quality of improvement, can we improve the quality? And that's a really hard question. I think because it's like thinking already wants to go into this mode of like, oh yeah, I am improving the quality as such. And I think that's what's like hard, so hard to think about that. But yeah, there is a kind of improving though. I would agree.
Well, and let me give it to Michelle here. You said a bunch of things. I almost feel as if no fields know why they exist. Literature, humanities, philosophy, psychoanalysis. Like we actually don't know what we're learning in any of these fields or what we're doing. And I want to note as well that basically what I think is they're all teaching better decision making. And they don't know it. Like you're reading literature to understand how the world is so you make better decisions in it. You're doing psychoanalysis so you can do better decisions. I would actually science, if this is how the world works, I would know not to jump off a bridge because I'll fall and die. Like I'm basically at the point where it is all about decision making and quality decision making. Arguably, the meaning of life is to make quality decisions. And if you're making quality decisions, the proof of it tends to be intrinsic motivation. Ergo, intrinsic motivation is the meaning of life. And these things seem to be circular. And then you could even get at the point where what you see of Jesus on the cross, and I have a lot more to say on that, but I'll give it to Michelle. Arguably, the cross would show that there is something about that radical openness to possibility that is in God himself, right? Like in God himself, like if Hegel is right about the future being entirely open and anything is possible, it is possible that God himself may have submitted himself to anything being possible and being open to that, right? And then that God himself is a creative process. And if God is like that, now that could be complete heresy, and I'd have to go into that because I would have more to say. But to be in the image of God, then the image and likeness of God would require you to be open as well, of that certain radicalness. And then that all comes down to choice and faith.
Yeah.
Like what is faith but choice? Like, what is faith but at the end of the day a kind of choice? So it would, and then of course the other thing I would say is I'm not saying that therapy never works for anyone, that mental health clinics never work for anything. What I would say is the following: when they work, I think they work because they teach people to make better decisions. They may not even know that, though. Like, they may think we made them feel better. That's why we work. We make people have more self-esteem. That's why they work. No, what therapy humanities do is teach people to make better decisions. And that's why they work. And they're misidentifying their effectiveness, actually. I'm not saying that self-esteem doesn't have a role, because if you have no self-confidence, you can't make decisions. I'm not saying that feeling good has no role, because if you feel bad, it's hard to make decisions. But there's two questions. How do you help a person's life, and how do you sustain them in that help? The sustaining is the big one. The sustaining is the choice. And like people like, oh, we read literature because it's pleasurable. Then who cares? There's this therapeutic view of the humanities now that makes me sick. And it's the same thing. The humanities has been destroyed by this. It's interesting. We're getting a PhD. It's all therapeutic, right? No, the humanities is about understanding the world to make better decisions in it. The quality of decision making seems to be central here. And basically none of the fields even know that's what they're teaching. That's my claim. Like, philosophy doesn't know it's actually primarily teaching better decisions. The literature doesn't know that. Psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, like, they don't know that. The ability to make quality decisions is basically the main thing that is required to be a human being. Let me give it to Michelle.
Okay. So I was thinking about how, I do see a lot of compatibility with Julie Reshi's work and Christianity. Like, I think about the verses in Romans where it talks about, like, to live is Christ, to die is gain, or talks about, like, for we have died with Christ. Like, there's a lot of this language of, like, we actually did die already. Like, so, and even our actual death wouldn't be, like, this is not something to really count as anything but, for them it would be gain. Now, I think the language of gain could maybe not be as compatible, right? Because it's this idea of, like, getting something or getting something from it. But what do you really get with death, right? But death itself. Now, in the there might be some transcendent views of, like, this union with God that is, more, in line with, like, the theological understanding. But there's this interesting idea of this sense of, like, oh yeah, guys, we all died long ago. Like, there's this real living dead concept that I think that really comes out in the epistles really strongly with Paul, and I find that really interesting. The other thing I wanted to say was I really love that quote you shared, Javier, about this sort of, like, the suffering pleasure principle being, like, in the background of, like, this whole concept of suffering always being basically able to be pleasure too. So it's like you can never escape that in some ways. And so then therefore it seemed like Reshi's point was almost like it's not suffering enough. But I wonder if it's almost just better than to go in the direction of indifference, like Daniel brought up in the comments of on the YouTube channel for your wonderful review of Reshi's book. Like, indifference to me would almost be like, and again, this maybe it's problematic to even talk about it, right? Because it's like, well, are we trying to find a solution? Are we trying to find what's, like, better? But if we do get too caught in the pleasure principle that drives even suffering to be in basically the two sides of the same coin with pleasure, then is it better to think about it just in terms of indifference? And then also that kind of to kind of go along with that question, even the idea of, like, improving the quality of our decisions. Is there something that can be, like, problematic in, maybe it's the fact that the fact that when somebody's talking about it, it's almost like when somebody's like, I'm going to do all these things, and then the fact that they said it, now it's almost like they don't do it, or they find themselves kind of comparing themselves to other people, or, like, they find themselves in this, like, stuck place. Or they're always feeling better because maybe they did do it, now they feel better than everybody or something. So it's sort of the dynamic of it being somewhat problematic to sort of talk about it, about improving, right? But there is a real thing where we do live lives that do incur decision making, so we have to do something with that. So yeah, is there even something about, like, talking about trying, okay, could indifference be better? Is that even polemic because it's still sort of trying to improve upon something? So I'm just going to throw that out there. I hope that makes sense. I'm probably going to get back to folding and stuff, but yeah, wanted to include my question here.
That's beautiful. I'll give it to Javier. And I will note as well, there's, again, because I have to make a Hegel reference, there's the weird relation of the phenomenology of spirit to the science of logic, where you go, it's like the difference between public and hysteric, public religion and hysteric, where you have to go through the phenomenology of spirit to find out that all of that was on the side of understanding, and it actually didn't occur that way. It's just you had to go through thinking it was that way. So the idea could get to the place where it's ready for the science of logic. And there might be also as well where in an extremely therapeutic age, because for Hegel, it does have to end on being with absolute indifference, because pessimism always moves into optimism, optimism moves into pessimism, they always go back and forth. But then there's the issue, if you have an age where everything is therapeutic today, do you have to emphasize the pessimistic in order to then get to the impotence? Now, I do think there's a danger in that emphasis, because you might lose something, but there might be something here between this problem of the public and the hysteric, the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic as well. But let me give it to Javier.
Yeah, no, this is a good question, Michelle. So I think I would look at indifference, because we're talking about quality of the process, right? I would look at it like this. I think what we're left with Julie Resch's work is ways of dying, which would, in some sense, improve decision making, because it's about knowing the ways of dying. Because it doesn't change the fundamental negativity of it, because you're still going to die. And that also reveals the sort of abyssal nature of choice, because fundamentally you have to make another choice again. There's a way in which we make choices and it feels like dying, and we're constantly dying again. Now, I think the danger would be, but I know Julie Resch explicitly is against this idea of being like, oh, there's this dying and then dying better. I wouldn't put it as dying better. I would put it as a kind of reincarnational element to it, where it's like you die, reincarnate, die again, but you've encountered another way of dying. But I wouldn't call it a new way. I wouldn't call it not a new way, but I wouldn't call it a better way of dying. And I think this corresponds quite well with Zizek's absolute recoil. Well, becoming is from nothing to nothing, but there's a sense in which there is something new, but because you can never know the past, the past is also kind of lost too with that. It rewrites the past, right? So yeah, I think if I were to place Julie Resch's work, I think the quality is found. So I think that's what's so difficult to talk about quality too, because we think fundamentally when we talk about quality of life, we're talking about like some type of benefit we're trying to gain from this. And that's like where people like get into this therapeutic mode. But I think if we look at like, look, there's ways to die that maybe you didn't know about, which is really important, even though it doesn't change the outcome in terms of like you're still gonna die. Like there's still this abyssal nature to our being. But there is ways to die. And I think that ways to die is the quality improvement that we need to look out for. Ways of dying. What are the ways of dying that we can find? And I think right now, if I were to historically contextualize Resch's work, I think that right now the emphasis is this specific way of dying, which is that kind of pessimism that is needed to kind of counteract the overt optimism of our time. That's how I would place her in historical context. Now, again, that would need to change too, because even she understands that there is an ultimate failure of everything that she's saying, which is funny because in some sense, at the end of her book, she basically refutes everything that she laid out as a premise, which kind of fucking confused me, because I was like, yeah, but you said that, like you said all those things, and then you're like, yeah, if you believe that you could just walk around life thinking like everything's like you're just a living dead figure and there's no purpose or whatever, like in some sense she basically said you still don't get what I'm saying. So I think you can look at Julie Resch twofold, in the sense that she's currently responding to a contextual historical problem, which is needed, which is another way of dying that we need. And then of course it refutes itself, because that way needs to die too. So I think the only true reconciliation that is probably unsaid in Julie Resch is actually death. Right. I think that's what it would ultimately be. And I think when we talk about the quality of life, it's not some type of progressive improvement or something, but the fact that the quality is the fact that it's in the dying itself, and the ways of dying that we can explore together as individuals and a community. That's what thinking kind of led me to.
This is marvelous. I'll give it to Michelle. There is absolutely a problem where a word is missing between quantitative, qualitative. The issue is you almost need qualitative, like a different qualia. That word is what qualitative, like if you look at like Hegel, whatever, qualitative does not mean better or worse. It has something to do more with qualia. And you see, we don't have that. And you see, the thing about if I were to say, hey, Javier, you can make X choice and gain echolocation, you will have a different qualia of experience. Would that be better or worse? No idea. Those categories don't fit. It might be awful. You'll be confused because now you're so used to learning, right? Like, so here's the issue. When we're talking about qualitative changes, you can't say they're better or worse. All we can say is there's the what? The risk. This is the key. Like, all there is in life is the risk, the bet, the what? The leap of faith. She's very Kierkegaardian, just without the theology, because for freaking Kierkegaard, the leap of faith is not merely theology. It is the logical end of the inability to escape either or. All there is at the end of the day is the choice. And all choice, of course, for Kierkegaard is faith, right? Because you have to have faith in the choice going X or Y way. But then for Kierkegaard, he also too is like, but you don't even know if the choice is going to work out. So it's just a leap of faith. It's just a pure emphasis is on the leap of faith into who knows what. And that too is what we're seeing here. So I'll give it to Michelle. Like, we can't talk about better. We can only talk about difference. We have to talk about risk. We have to talk about qualitative, although that is what like qualitative should mean, but it doesn't. And once you start getting that, it's like we're talking about changes in ways of experiencing, and that it's like an openness to the unknown. Will you be better off if you have these new experiences? Don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you're better, but not this other person. So you just leave behind the judgment language, even though there will be a judgment. And it also would be going too far to say that a good judgment is unfounded because you took the risk and maybe it is good. You feel better to have low echolocation or not. But that can't be in your conscious mind that this will be good. The moment you say this will be good, it's not a leap of faith anymore. You're leaping because you think it's guaranteed. All judgment of the good must come from a true leap of faith, a true abysmal. It must be a byproduct of the choice, not the centrality of the choice. Now, of course, also from Augustine, we learn there's no such thing as a bad motivation. So if you choose to do X instead of Y, you must do it because you think it's good to do X instead of Y. The issue is the order, the primacy. Of course, you make choices because you think it's better to do X instead of Y. The issue is the guarantee and not taking seriously the depth drive. And basically, to me, what I hear is we need to stop making choices to escape the depth drive. We need to make choices with the depth drive, given the depth drive, given that no object will bring you final happiness. Okay, well, given that, everything is about the training, the ability, the qualitative way of life. That seems to be where that's kind of the negation sublation, if you will. That's the kind of, okay, well, what does this all mean? Well, this, it's the difference, risk, qualitative. But let me give it to Michelle. Michelle. So qualitative. So anyway, Michelle.
Oh, yes. All I was going to say is that's very good because it's like these idea of like how to, it's not like die better, but more so like what are other ways to die? And I think this is good though, because the fact that she's critiquing positive psychoanalysis, right, means that they fail too, right? But they need to fail in a different way. Maybe they need to fail more. And I think that, so that's helpful for me. So anyways, I just wanted to say that really quick. Yeah, thanks.
No, there is like, the question is it's like bad failure versus good failure, right? It's like bad death, there's the bad philosophy, good philosophy of David Hume, right? Like her whole, like you said, that's very important. They did fail.
Yeah, right. Like they failed because they were too positive. They were too therapeutic or too bent on getting good goals. So, yeah. But basically, instead of it being good or bad, it's about it being a different type of failure, or a different type of death.
Right. And there has to be some sort of idea, and then I'll give it to Javier. There has to be some idea that you wouldn't be critiquing psychoanalysis as therapeutic if there was no sense that it would be better for it not to be so therapeutic, right? So there is some sort of judgment that's occurring, but what is it? But that judgment is what? What is it based on? Truth. So he's saying the truth is that the death drive is deeper than people realize, right? So he's saying, and that's why it would be better to not have a therapeutic psychoanalysis, because otherwise it's a kind of lie in a way, right? Because it's not taking it. But that's really important, though, because that does mean there's grounds for good and bad, if you will, based on true and false. And arguably true is better than false because it's actual, not because it feels good, because it's actual. And so the question is, like, how do we move in the direction of the actual, right? That seems to be what we're getting at. And the thing is, like, the truth is there is only difference in a way, right? Not better or worse, there's only difference. So that's actual, okay? Likewise, the future is open radically, therefore choice is actual. So to me, the movement that we're going in to stress risk, difference, and choice, if you just give me those three right now, that is better on grounds of actuality, not on grounds of just opinion or feeling. Like, it makes you more concrete and real with what reality is like to be emphasizing different and risk and choice. And to me, that's why, like, for me, when Hegel's like absolute indifference, like, you're indifferent to assessments based on emotion or happy or whatever. And what you're focused on is from a place of absolute indifference. Then it's openness to the future, choice, and the unfolding of difference. And that's where it's moving. And for me, what Julie Rez is getting, like, her idea of we need to, the moment she says we shouldn't be as therapeutic, she is saying it would be better not to be so therapeutic, right? But that is valid because he's saying the truth is the death drive is deeper than we realize. Okay, well then guess what? If the future is radically open, if there is only difference and not newness, and if everything depends on choice because we're free, then a life that makes that sensual is actually better than one that doesn't, because it's based on actuality. So it's interesting here to think if the judgment has to be based on actuality here. I'd be curious, what do you think of that, Javier?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like this difference of understanding between, like, the trap that we have a tendency to fall into, even with thinking about failure, is we start thinking about some final failure. And I think that was her initial critique of psychoanalysis too, is that it was negative enough, but then it got complacent with this idea of like a final failure, where Freud was saying, like, okay, we can turn hysteria into just common unhappiness, right? And that is a kind of settling for a final failure. But if you take the death drive seriously, there is no final failure ever. And in the same way, there is no final benefit ever. And I think she's trying to strip away finality completely, because that's what the death drive does. It sort of strips away the finality of it all. And that it has to perpetually fail. And so I think you're right. There is this way of improving, because even the fact that we strip away the final failures and the final benefit, there is this improving. There is this contact with actuality. But the contact of actuality is in the process, and has to always be in the process. And I think our own self-interestedness always wants to impede as an obstacle and say, you got it, you found it, or there it is, there's nothing left. All there is this failure. And the moment you succeed to a final failure, you're no different from saying that there's this final benefit. And I think that's the part that she's trying to point out to.
One of the things here that we're seeing is, again, we're getting to this realm of very, very fine distinctions. And like, the foundation of the building, if it's all financed, everything is off. So there seems to be a difference between better, positive, and actual, where Julie Ress would say she's against positive. She's against the positive, but that doesn't mean she's necessarily against the better. But here's the trick. It's better to be more actual, but here's the weird Hegelian move. If you become more actual, you didn't get better because there was only an illusion. So there was nothing there to get better from. This is the weird move, like where you leave behind. Like if you become more actual, Michelle, I was just saying, if you become more actual, there's a weird way in which you're not better because there was nothing there that you're becoming better from. So this is the weird way that the only betterness is always got a slash through it, in a kind of like, it's always got a dash through it, okay? So then maybe we shouldn't talk about better, because when you say better, because maybe the actual is worse. right? Maybe you make a choice that makes you more aligned with reality, and now your life sucks, right? So we can't even use the language of better. And yet, in another way, there's a way in which if you become more actual, that's better ontologically, even if it's not experientially better, right? So this is why Hegel sucks in reading Hegel, because there's always this vanishing of the thing you just talked about. You say, oh, okay, you became more actual. Well, that means you didn't become better because it was an illusion and there was nothing there to become better for. But relative to that illusion, it's kind of better because it was an illusion, and it's better relative to reality, and the only standard is reality. So even if it's emotionally worse, it's ontologically better. But then wait, and then you blow up. So there's this weird vanishing that's going on here that I think Julie Ress is also trying to capture, right? So it's all about becoming more actual. Like, and by actual, that would mean alignment with the actual. And then this is why the question is, what is actuality? For Hegel, actuality is open, unknown, and shaped by choice. Well, I think there's a lot of reason to think that's probably true if the therapeutic doesn't work in the way we think it does. If everything comes down to choice, then it would seem reality has some sort of radical openness to it, right? And so then the death drive, taking that seriously, is the precondition to being open to that radical possibility and then choosing better. So to me, it's like this weird thing, and then I'll just give it to whoever wants to speak. There's a weird thing in which getting better equals becoming more actual, which means you didn't become better because there was nothing there to become better from. So success equals a vanishing of the category of better that was only meaningful because you were in a mistake, but it didn't really even exist because it wasn't actual, so there's no better. So maybe we shouldn't talk about better. We should just talk about the raw abyssal choice. And then, of course, the issue is you have to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. So there's no guarantee, because at any moment you could stop and then it's over. And in fact, even think there's a guarantee probably means you stop choosing because you don't think you have to, and now you're screwed, right? So there's this weird perpetuality that has to occur.
Yeah, I think like I was thinking about this the other day. Like when you look at an object, there's a way in which you keep looking at it and you're like, okay, I understand it better. But actually, like that's actually not true, because it was always there. The actuality of what you understand was always there. So it's this, our mind does this weird trick on us where we go like, oh yeah, I understand it better. But it's like, actually, no, there was a kind of like dying process that you went through that you're like, oh, this is what it is. And then continuously, as you keep looking at it, you start discovering there's more to what it is. But it's not that it's more to what it is, it's that the fact that it always was. It's what it always was. And so, yeah, I think that's the part of the death drive that she's trying to stay true to, which, like, yeah, we've always been this sort of like abyssal creature, and society too. And I think when she interprets Hegel and Kierkegaard, I think she's just fighting against the complacency that some people interpret them with.
Sure.
Which I think that's probably like the most charitable reading that we could probably give without completely dismissing Kierkegaard and completely dismissing Hegel. I think it's just, I mean, honestly, it's the same thing. It's the same critique that Buber gave in his Between Man and Man with Hegel. He's trying to say, look, like, even the future is not guaranteed, so we're all in this like holy insecurity together. And I think the death drive is probably something similar to that, like a holy insecurity. And she does, towards the end of the book, she talks about this negative thing almost theologically, because she's like, we have to guard the negative. We have to, it's sacred. The negative is sacred. And so there is something to that. There is something theological in that. I think the only reason why she strays away from theology, and I think that's why Buber critiqued some theological doctrines, is that fundamentally we risk it becoming a prescription.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's also this risk where we read thinkers like Kierkegaard and Hegel, and they become prescriptions. And that would be kind of missing their point in some ways, because we understand that you can't really live a prescription, because then you're not actually dying. You don't really understand the full horror of making a choice. You're sort of depending upon their logic. When you can't really depend on their logic, you have to sort of live their logic, which is really hard to explain.
Yeah.
What does it mean to live, Kierkegaard's leap of faith? What does it mean to live this sort of Hegelian indifference that Hegel is talking about? It can't be under prescription. That's the thing. And I think a lot of people kind of fall into that. And I think that's where Reshi's critique is valid. And I think Reshi ends up basically kind of weirdly critiquing herself in the end by saying, look, if you think you read this book and understood as a kind of supplement and method to live your life, then you're wrong. Because there is no solution and there's no prescription to what I'm saying. And so, yeah, I think it does come back to the abyssal nature of choice. And there is something sacred about that, and there's something horrifying about that. And there is something beautiful. It's a beautiful, horrific vision, abyssal nature of choice and living, that I think she's trying to keep us, I would say, vigilant over. It's just kind of this awareness. And I think the dark night of the soul is that sort of guardianship of that awareness. Our tendency for self-complacency, our tendency to forget, our tendency to just fall into ways that we think are guaranteed. And so in some sense, the dark night of the soul is infinite. It is perpetual. And yet there's a way that we kind of understand that it's no longer the dark night of the soul because it's actuality.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Well, so a few things. So there are some like mystics that say you need to tell people God doesn't exist because that's their only hope of encountering God. And you must never, ever say that God exists because you're dooming them. Like these weird, like when you get into shamanism, hysteric, Sufi, there's all of these weird, like people don't know the deep, weird religious practices that arise when you really, really think the problems of theology. And you're like, it becomes very performative because it must become performative. And yet it's not performative because it's the only way to be actual, because the human is born fallen. There's something about the human that is born not right. And in order to fix that not rightness, you have to do things that are not right that result in it being right. Because, so for example, the human, the key, a way to put it is that the human does not experience ideas like experience. There is a difference between ideas and experiences. That's a major problem. That is an unbelievably major problem. And there is no way to get around it. So no matter how much I speak to you, no how many ideas I put in your head, those will never, no matter how well I describe suffering, it will never be the experience of suffering. That is a major problem. Because how then do I make you, especially if the human needs the experience of suffering to thrive? So what does that mean I do? I need to make Javier suffer. Well, I'm not a good friend then. And how do I do that in a manner that has the impact of the negative sublative, right? So I'm like, well, Javier, you need to suffer. Well, then he's just going to go do it because I told him to and not have the deep existential dilemma going on, right? The point is, the split between ideas and experiences, when you get to this level of the deepest ontology, the deepest metaphysics, that problem becomes insanely pronounced. And a lot of the great religious mystics get there and go, what do we do? I mean, this is where like Gregory of Nicaea is like, well, you gotta use secrets, you gotta use mysticism, you gotta use performance, you gotta do all this weird stuff, because that's you literally tell people God doesn't exist because it's only when they truly believe God. It's like Peter Rollins doing all these things, right? Like atheism for Lent, right? Like you need atheism to be a Christian. That makes no sense at all unless you understand the divide between ideas and experiences, and that the only way for the human to get fixed is to believe they can't be fixed. Like if irony is the fabric of reality, if irony is the human condition, then the way you teach has to be ironic. It's like Walker Percy once said that if everyone's standing on their head, the only way to show people how to stand up is to look like you're standing on your head, right? That's the problem. Is like if the nature of reality is ironic, then the only way to show people out of irony is to look like there's no way out of irony. It's to look like the way is irony, right? Which means there's no way out of irony. And so this is what we're seeing. When you get to this level, you're at this level, to truly teach ontological paradox or irony or whatever you want to call it, then you run against the divide between ideas and experiences that you somehow have to explain in a manner that works. But by definition, talking about it is still an idea. So there's an event horizon, like a limit to a black hole that you're always hitting, that you're always hitting, that you're always hitting, that you're always hitting. And is describing what I just described helpful? Does that somehow help? Or is that just an idea? You see?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
is there some sort of improvement that occurs to the person that hears everything I just said? Is it an improvement? Is it not an well, wait a minute. I just said there's a difference between ideas and experiences. So it can't be an improvement because everything I just said was an idea, not an experience. And yet, does knowing there's a difference between idea and experience constitute an improvement? Maybe. It depends on what? The choices you make. It depends on what you do next. It's not going to improve you now. And if you don't do stuff, because why? Why does it depend on choice? Because it depends on experience. What is a choice but an experience, right? Like, you're choosing experiences, right? So the entire ability of everything we're saying to have any sort of actualization is contingent upon the choice that then that means that the value of a philosophical discussion is contingent upon what occurs outside the philosophical discussion. It is always dependent on what's missing from the church, because it's the actions that result afterwards. That's why philosophy always seems useless, because its validation comes from what can never be included in the philosophy. In the same way that the validation of a religion is what occurs outside the church when you're not looking at the religion. The validity of mystical teaching comes from when you're not learning about mysticism. So it's always missing. The thing that you're talking about is always missing in the act of talking, as it structurally must, because ideas are not experiences. And this is the problem that you're looping. A few more things, and I'll pass it on. The other thing is, like you were talking about the cup. Oh, also, I don't blame anyone for misreading, because in the same way that depth drive is inescapable, misreading is inescapable. Like, that's just what it means to be human. If you didn't misread the book, you didn't try to read it. Like, you did misread it. Whatever the book is, you misread it. After 50 times of reading Hegel, you're misreading it. So I don't blame anyone for misreading, because I grew up reading Hegel that way. I grew up reading Kierkegaard that way. I don't blame anyone. And you're kind of forced, like, you're basically forced to talk about the popular understanding of Hegel, because it's 90% of people's understanding of Hegel. So I don't like, and then you read Harold Bloom with The Anxiety of Influence. I think intellectualism now is at a point where we just need to not care about that. Like, okay, you misheard, so what? Like, it's like you said, Socrates just takes the terms. Whatever they are, just go with it. Like let's not do this academic, who's got the right reading of Hegel? I promise you, Hegel doesn't care. So like, let's just move. So I have no problem with that. The other thing is, like you were describing with the cup. Here's the key. What you describe with the cup is basically, it's all about qualitative change. It's all about qualitative change. That's what it's all about. That's why I talk about beauty. The fate of beauty is the fate of us, because beauty is hermeneutic. Like, it's all about qualitative change. That's what happened with the cup. You didn't get a better understanding. What happened? Your qualia of the cup changed, right? What happens when you learn philosophy? Do you become a quote unquote better person? Who knows? Because by what standard do you determine that? But what I can guarantee you occurs is that your qualitative experience of the world changes, right? After you do philosophy, the way you experience conversation is different. Is it not? Is it not the case? I think everyone, if this is what I'm getting at. If you ask people, is your life better because of philosophy or not? They probably don't. They might go, yes, maybe, I'm not sure, yes. They get confused. You'll see that all the time. I think once you identify it as self-defense, it clearly does make things better. Like David Hume and all that. But if you ask the following question, is your life qualitatively different after philosophy? The answer is absolutely yes. Yes, I experienced life differently. Okay, so there was a change, right? There was a change. Now, this is the question. Then you say, okay, do you think your life is better given that qualitative change? That's the question. And it becomes clearer than what we're asking when we say, has philosophy made your life better? We're asking if your qualitative changes are better now that you've had those qualitative. And then it becomes clearer what we're talking about. So likewise, if you ask, has psychoanalysis made your life better? People go, maybe, yes, kind of, sort of, I'm not sure. Okay, has your qualitative life changed after psychoanalysis? I think everyone would say, yes, I experience human beings and subjects and the mind differently. Okay, are you better for that? Not therapeutic. Maybe let me go back and say, you would ask, do you think you're more actual instead of better? Let's say that, because we were saying better. Like, do you feel like you now, after psychoanalysis, are more actual in your qualitative experience than before? I think it becomes very easy to say, yes, Absolutely. Okay, do you feel after philosophy that you're more actual in your qualitative experience of life than not? I think you go, yes, absolutely. And some people say, yeah, because it's more uncertain. Yeah, because the world is open. That's the point when people are like, philosophy makes you more uncertain. Yes, because reality at its deepest level is uncertain because the future is open. You have now reconciled yourself with actuality. So to me, the language of qualitative can start getting at a lot of these different things. Let me give it back to you.
Yeah, this idea between experience and ideas, the way I looked at it was like, it's funny because I never got to talk to Andrew Luber about this. It's like we fundamentally live through representation. Our experiences are through representation. You could say representation of these ideas. And so that's what makes words so very difficult to even be like, oh yeah, I experienced something, but actually you're always experiencing something through your idea of suffering or through your representation of whatever you think actually is. So there's a way in it's so weird because there's a way in which you only experience ideas rather than like it's almost like an actual experience is so negative that you can't really be like, oh yes, I've experienced the truth. Because then it's like, oh, you're still representing, you still have some representation of what that truth is, and so now it has to be destroyed again.
Right.
And I think the death drive function, like I said before, as like this breaker of idols, where it's like if you lean into it and you're scared of it, then it's because you're scared of whatever idols that you don't think you might have are going to break, and then they do break, and then so in that moment you are having an actual experience, right?
Yes.
In some sense, you're having an actual experience. And I think it does. I think it does verge on something ineffable, right? You can't really say what it is in some sense, because if you do say it, then you're giving off a representation, and then well, even if it's not maybe representable, even if you say it, people start getting a representation, and that makes it really difficult to express what is actually happening. And that's why it's like, I think that's why you have to function ironically.
Yes.
Actually.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That's exactly why you have to function ironically.
Yes.
That's
why all the mystics are ironic and they're performative, because you get to the point where you go, oh my gosh, you must be ironic. Well, then you have to somehow figure out how to be ironic without being postmodern irony, which just is deconstructional. There are different kinds of irony. Like the postmodern sentiment that irony has a role to play is correct. But the problem is, without mysticism or the mystical experience or the philosophical journey, the only irony they can engage in is the deconstructional irony. What we're talking about here is a kind of mystical irony, if you want to use that language, or ontological irony, or irony that is at the depth of the problem of ideas not being experiences. So the postmodern notion that irony is important was correct, but they, in the act of postmodernity, kicked out the mysticism, ontology, metaphysics that they needed for that irony to be its fullest self, which is the irony that emerges when you understand the ontological state of affairs with the division of ideas is not experiences. So the irony becomes utterly necessary. And then in that irony, you start acting in a manner, and I'll give it back to you because I cut you off, in that you begin acting in a manner that qualitatively changes how you experience things. Then you understand, because here's the thing. If there's a split between ideas and experiences, and ontological irony is a necessary way of life, then you can't just be sitting on a rock with your fist. You can't just do abstract philosophy. You have to go experience. You have to go act. But likewise, you can't merely act, because act is going to ironically conceal from you the death drive that you're acting upon if you don't chart it, right? And so this is where it also works against philosophy as like academic ivory tower nonsense, but it also works against hard pragmatism that doesn't think you need ideas, because that's the other thing that the ontological irony does, is it makes a full human being. And that's the irony. Once you accept irony at deepest level, you would say, oh, there's no full humanity. No, that is where full humanity is, because now you have actuality. So there's a deeper mystical irony that has to be taken seriously.
Yeah, I agree. It's God, I mean, this problem is it's funny because like we say it's a problem and then we start thinking solutions. And then, it is so hard And it reminds me of Buber's quote in I Am Thou, where he's like, yeah, you can't find God in the world, and you can't find God outside of the world.
Right.
And so, like, what does that actually mean, right? Well, I mean, the way I interpret that is like you're trying to place yourself in some type of finality, some type of complacency that is fundamentally not actual, because you're like, oh, I know where to find it. It's going to be either in here or out there. And the moment you do that, you've already succumbed to some type of ideology. I think
Yes.
Rashi's work is really good at
Yes.
breaking or revealing ideology in its most visceral sense.
Yes.
Of course, I think she also understands the danger of, like, even if you take her seriously, it can become an ideology. And that's why I think she even dismisses right
Yes.
at the end. She goes, oh, if you think you're just a living figure of death, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, you still don't really get it. And it's weird because when she started talking about the social, it was like, so you've either come up, she talks about this like the way readers would interpret her. She's like, okay, so you've come up with either two solutions, right? That there's no point in fixing the world because that would be progressive, and virtually there is no hope, no purpose, and so on. And then there's the other one where it's like, okay, it's hopeless, but you continue to do so anyways, right?
Yes.
You continue to function. And she basically disregards both of these. And it blew my mind because I was like, well, what am I left with? And I think that's exactly what she's trying to reveal, is that sort of abyssal nature of like our kind of reflexive complacency to be like, okay, I know the truth now. I'm gonna just function the way I want to function because I understand the death drive, and I understand that we're just living figures of death. And she's like, no.
Yeah.
Because once again, and so it does put it, and she does talk about this briefly, I think, in the book too, where it's like there has to be this notion of the comic, the joke, where comedy sort of functions in this way of understanding that.
Yes.
Where it's like, it kind of laughs in your face of like, haha, you took that too seriously. Like, it was a joke. It was a joke. You took that way too seriously. And so it does make me think about, if we're talking about qualitative kind of measures, it does seem the avenue that is constantly repeated over and over is the artist, the joker. Why is that? Why is it the joker? Why is it the artist? Is it because they know ways of dying that we don't? And I think that the danger would be like, the artist is fundamentally self-destructive because he wants to put something out there in the world. And I think if you actually look at choice like a kind of self-destruction, because if you think about it, you have to know all the possibilities or think all the possibilities and then decide. That's self-destructive.
Yes.
You have to eradicate a multiplicity of possibilities to then make a choice. And I think what making better decision, like if we're talking about better decision making, looks like, it's not being confident in the fact that there's only one choice, or there's only one possibility. It's the fact that you are terrified of the paradox of choice, that there is so many choices that it terrifies you into this moment of like, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I should do this. But you are aware of all the infinite choices, and then you self-destruct and pick one. And it kind of functions the way our biology functions with apoptosis. It's a active programmed cell death. It decides which cell dies. And I think choice has to function just like that, that there is this fundamental horror of, there's so many choices, and now I have to fundamentally self-destruct all of them and pick one. And that might be what we're looking for with Julie Resch, that there is this way in which it is always self-destructive. Because we have to choose again.
Right.
But yeah, I'll leave it there.
You said a million really important things. I'll give it to Michelle. So first thing, only the things that entail the bothness direct us toward the ontological situation that is irony. So, for example, laughter is what you do when you're crazy and when you're happy. Tears are what you do when there's beauty and sadness. A choice destroys and also creates and actualizes, right? At deepest, reality is not a thing but a situation. And the situation is that human beings are broke. They're broke. There's something off about them, and they have to not be off. But they're broke, so by definition can't fix themselves. So deepest reality is a situation, not a premise. And the situation is ironic. The deepest situation is an ironic situation because only broken things exist to fix themselves, which actually, if they are broken, then they're not broken. They are what they are. You can't be broken. That just means you are what you are. So the fundamental Leibniz Hegelian situation, the absolute situation, is an irony. And the way to irony is what irony is always a bothness. Irony always is a bothness. It is a paradox. There has to be more than one for there to be irony, right? And the key is that tears, laughter, and choice, and maybe others, but those three come to mind, those are all bothness. They are in their nature bothness, and so they're unique in their ability to be paths, if you will, toward the ontological situation that is fundamentally a bothness. That's why it's unique. That's why the laughter, the joke, the beauty, the tears, the sadness, these things, that there are very few things in the world that have this unique Schrodinger-esque bothness to them that are uniquely positioned to make us toward the ontological situation of irony. And then if you actualize in that irony, the question is the following: do you have a different qualitative experience that is somehow better? That right there is the Heideggerian clearing. That's where you're beyond representation, you're beyond image. You say, all Heidegger's like, let's just get to the clearing, the openness, and then being can come forth, and we're not going to represent anything. We're not going to choose anything. So you wonder, which is, wow, this cup isn't what I think. Socrates, wonder. Then you clear to the ontological situation. You get to this radical openness. Then you wait, Buber, and you self-defense anyone that tries to pull you out of it. And the name of the game is that, to get to that clearing, that radical openness. And also to the point, like a Julia Rest at the end saying it's nothing, and I'll give it to Michelle. One of the reasons Thomism, the work of Thomas Aquinas, is one of the greatest theologies in my opinion around is because at the end of his life, Aquinas said what? It's all straw. The best theologies at the end say it was all straw. Then you're like, well, what was the point? Yeah, that is the point. Also, lastly, the doctrine of predestination for many Calvinists is actually a public doctrine, but not a esoteric doctrine. You tell the public they are predestined so that then if they make a choice to serve God, it's actually most meaningful. So the doctrine of predestination is a public doctrine that you must believe to make a real choice. And that's kind of, there's actually a very interesting public versus esoteric theology behind the doctrine of predestination in some Calvinist circles, where you emphasize, you never, ever, ever as the preacher tell people they're not predestined, because if you do that, they can no longer make a true choice. They no longer have free will. So belief in predestination becomes what you must believe to have a free choice. So that's the kind of mystical esoteric thing, in the same way that a true theology must at the end say it's all false. Like that's the only way to have a true theology. But let me give it to Michelle.
So that was all really good from both of you. And I honestly, like, my question, I feel like was already addressed, because I was thinking about this idea of, Julie Rush also negating even herself in the way she closes her book. And that it's almost like, what does that really leave us with? And then I was like, do you guys think that's the place for the choice, where it's like, it leaves you with yourself?
Yes.
And that's essentially where you operate from. And it doesn't give you anything prescriptive per se, and yet, you're going to have to choose, like, because you it's not like it's not even prescription for her, becoming a hermit or something. It's like, and even that would be a choice. Like, you can't escape it. So, but I was kind of wondering if you guys think that's like where the choice would really kind of come in. What are you left with? You're left with yourself, and then you're left with essentially the abyssal choice. So, yeah. I feel like that was the answer, but I just wanted to.
I think I'll give it to Javier, but I think basically that is the practical implication. You get to in the book, and now you have to choose, in the same way that if you're taught about predestination, the practical implication is now you have to make a choice of how you respond to that predestination, right? So it's a similar, you definitely are left with a choice. And if we go back to these ancient mystical, shamanistical, not so much, well, mystical, there is some shamanism like this. It's like you intentionally leave the book saying this book was irrelevant, knowing in a mental game of chess that the reader is now left with a choice. And that ironic kind of situation is the necessary kind of bothness where the book is written because it wants to create a situation that can't be contained in the book. That situation being the response to a book that just told you that it's irrelevant. So the book has to tell you it's irrelevant, but the reason it's telling you that is to make a situation where you have to make a choice, which is the point, but it can never say that was the point because then it won't work. So there's that's the kind of aesthetic tradition, if you will. But Javier or Michelle, anyone.
Well, just really quick, and it's not. I feel like I want to say it's really much more ontological because it's not even just a choice about what you're going to do with Reshi's book. It's more so what is the choice of your own existence, because that is what you're left with, right?
Yes.
So even if we want to separate it a little bit from we're not having to choose what we feel about Julie Reshi's book, it's just more so that you are left with yourself and you are left with basically nothing else. And then you are left as the ontological condition, which for humans is choice. So that's all I want to say. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree, Michelle. There is something about Julie Reshi because I think I really loved her article, her little piece on forgiveness, and I think love. And it's like this. It's like all of these lacks is like fundamentally what help us connect to each other. So it's like there's something about, you could say, I think the death drive is what fundamentally roots us as ontological beings, or it roots us in the ontological. And there's a way in which we keep trying to get away from the ontological. And I think that's what she's trying to do, is this constant reminder of getting rooted back into the ontological. Yeah, I was gonna bring this up because Buber, he there's a line of Buber where he's like, I didn't teach anything, I simply pointed. I think that might be a good language, because it wouldn't be about prescriptions, but it would be about pointing. And the question is, can we improve the quality of our pointing rather than prescriptions? And I again, I think this fundamentally goes back to beauty in everything, because beauty is about vision. And when you point, you're looking at something, you're wanting to look at something in a different way that you didn't expect before. And prescriptions always want you to tell you how to look at something, whereas pointing leaves it sort of uncertain as to the way that you should look. And that means you have to decide how you should look and how you should approach your looking. And I think that's what it's all about. And so I think when we're dying, I think with every choice, in a real ontological sense, we die, and then we encounter a kind of ironic new way of looking, which is not necessarily an improvement, but it's this constant interaction with actuality, where we're constantly pointing at this thing, where we need this pointing rather than this prescriptive way of saying, yes, that's what's pointing. And so I do think Julie Reshi, fundamentally, if I were to go back at her again, I would say, I think all she's doing is she's doing a kind of pointing, which is difficult because we think that comes with her saying, oh, you've taught us how to point. No, she's just pointing. And what she's pointing at can't be said how to look at it, can't be said how to go about it. She's just saying, look, this is what's there, and you have to deal with that that actuality, the actuality that only everything points and does not prescribe. And I think maybe that's what connects us as beings and with nature and everything else, is that it only ever points. And so that leaves room for actual experiences, because it's not prescribed, and we can't anticipate it, and we can't prepare for it, because if we were to prepare for it, we know what we're preparing for, so we can't do that. But yeah, I'll let you go, Daniel.
I really, really like that emphasis on pointing there. I think that's exactly right. Like, what psychoanalysis, philosophy of the humanities are doing is pointing. And if I were to ask you, would you is it better to have someone pointing for you at what you should do or not? it's a much better language because you're like, well, I don't know. Are they pointing at the right thing? You know, do I do it? Like, that's where the language of would you rather have me pointing at something or not? It's not really captured in the language of better or not, because I could be wrong. Maybe it's better if you do it, but it's a much more contingent relationship. But it's also not the same as me not pointing. There is something occurring, but it's in this middle space between good and bad, not so clear. So pointing, the emphasis is on difference, choice, abyssal choice, pointing. This seems to be more getting at what exactly psychoanalysis, philosophy, and everything is going. As we come up on the close, because I fear I will have to close, but anyone has final thoughts, you know, a few more things come to mind. All right, so it would seem like so many of the problems or situations we've outlined is a result of the split between ideas and experiences. Do you grant me that? Like, if ideas equaled experiences, we wouldn't have any of these situations, right? So the question is the following. What is the result of ideas not being experiences? Well, one, we end up in irony. One, we're dealing with all of these problems of sin not equaling the experience of sin. Talking about the death drive is not the same as truly believing the death drive. So we have all the problems we talked about, right? That are only problems if you don't know about them and, you know, the language doesn't quite work, okay? But here's the other thing. Because ideas are not experiences, it is possible to create. You can take a cup and say, oh, this is used for water, but you're not bound by your experience to only use it for water. You could use it as a phone, right? Because ideas are not experience, it's possible to create, okay? We can create. So if ideas equaled experiences, we might actually be in hell, actually, because you'd be locked in a determinist world. You couldn't change, you couldn't create. So the split of which leads to all of these wild situations that we've described between public and hysteric, idea of death drive experience is precisely the necessary condition for creation. If there's no possibility of creation, there's no freedom. By definition, freedom is creation. Like, you change determination into necessity, right? Like, you can't imagine freedom if there's only causation. You can have causation and creation, but if there's no creation at all, there's no freedom, right? So the split between ideas and experiences is what makes possible freedom. And that freedom, if indeed it is possible to have different qualitative experience, then that freedom makes it how it is possible to create new qualitative experiences, right? So then the pointing is precisely the work of being directed toward creating new qualitative experiences, right? If the net 42, I think it was 42, where we talked about Vervaeke, vertical causation, relational ontology, and how there is no subject-object divide, what we experience changes what's there. And we know that experience has something to do with how the world unfolds. We know that mantis shrimp sees colors that humans do. We know that there are different qualitative experiences. If it is true, and you could even bring up that Sheldrick guy who talks about morphic resonance and all that crazy stuff, and we know you have psychedelic experiences, right? If it is true that there is some sort of link between the qualitative experience, human consciousness, and the way that reality unfolds, and if it is possible for humans to freely create new qualitative experience because of the division between ideas and experiences, then perhaps the very chains of qualitative experiences changes reality. That we actually do co-create, like made in the image and likeness of God in the Garden of Eden, just like Adam is supposed to be actually participating in creation, then this actually would perhaps all suggest that human ontology is deeply participatory in the unfolding of reality. And so then the name of the game is, in fact, choosing a life that has better or more actual, because the theory here is that the more actual you are, the more you will have more actual qualitative experiences, which will then actually change and create actuality. It is completely possible, and that would be the absolute idealism of Hegel. That would be the ontological relations of a Whitehead and Bergson. That would be getting at the vertical causation of Wolfgang Smith. I think it does have something to do with the transcendental naturalism of Vervaeke and all of them. But then all of the unlocking, if you will, of that metaphysical vision requires the psychoanalytical road, that is the pointing, that is the acceptance deeply of the depth drive, that then brings you through the road of irony to the ironic situation of that is a result of ideas not having being experiences, which then getting changes how you make decisions, skills, and act in the world, so that then you then actualize that actual change of how things are in terms of the actual change of your qualitative experience. What that would mean is that ultimately the only way to really kind of unlock or to really take seriously the fullness of absolute idealism of Hegel, perhaps the transcendental naturalism of Vervaeke, perhaps the vertical causation of Wolfgang Smith, perhaps the ontological relations of Whitehead and Bergson, all of these different visions, or the participation, the co-creation in Christianity of Adam in the garden, then the only way to actually engage in that is by taking the death drive seriously. Because until you do that, you will not die to yourself to thus relate to the world in a manner that is actual, that then changes your qualitative experience in a manner that then actually changes the world and how it freely unfolds. And then we can see then why all the religions emphasize so strongly to believe you are a sinner, you are fallen, you need to really, really die, humility, overcoming pride. You see that all of that is part of the vision of sort of unlocking the fullness of the human participation in the world. And then boom, the pointing becomes a big deal because it is pointing toward those qualitative changes that are very, very deep indeed.
This is a question that I haven't considered, like how would co-creation look like with the death drive? And of course, I think the language would have to change a little bit, but I think it would still fundamentally, I think would be meaning the same things. Because Sabina Spielrein talks about destruction as becoming. And there's a way in which, if you think about destroying something, it's kind of like negative sculpting, where there is actually creation being done. And there is this sort of chipping away of sculpting and making something that is fundamentally destructive. And I think thinking about co-creating, or maybe I would put it like co-destructing. Yeah, I mean, I think this is the only way that we can relate to each other in a real way. Because if we take, Julie Reshi seriously in the idea of like our positive projects, what we end up doing with our positive projects instead of, I think there's this thing where we think creation doesn't involve destruction. And I think that's what Julie Resch is fighting against, where it's like, because if you pay attention to the artist does have to destroy himself to create something. He does. And Nietzsche talks about this too a lot. And so I think, yeah, there is this risk with, if we create without destruction, we're only effacing ourselves. And it's hard to catch, because it's like it manifests as some external enemy that needs to be eradicated, right? And that's typically, I guess, how people kind of look at the death drive. But I think really, I mean, I guess maybe it's my theological tendencies, but and Julie Resch, I think, would agree too. It's like the death drive really helps us be aware of our tending or perpetual self-effacement in self-interest. And if you could, and it's funny because that ironically manifests as the life drive, as the pleasure drive, as the drive towards preservation in life. And so the moment that we do that, we are fundamentally destroying each other, but it's not, it's weird. It's not actually destroying in the sense of creation. It's like a different kind of destroying. It's an effacement, like you would call it, Daniel. It's an effacement. And so, yeah, I think as a society, and this is the part that gets really chaotic, is like, I think if we even talk about improving society, then we're thinking about, oh, I can recreate society without destruction somehow. And I think that's a danger, and I think that's us falling again to thinking that there's a solution. But weirdly enough, society, we connect together as a society and individual because we fail as an individual and as a society. And I think that would be the ironic Jerusalem, that the Jerusalem is fundamentally a failure, but it's not a final failure. It's a perpetual failure. And that's what helps us co-create together or co-destruct together. And this is what helps us keep in touch with actuality, that sort of abyssal nature of us being perpetual failures, being always having a lack that's always there and we're always trying to get rid of. And that's what connects us. And that's what helps us, it's the only thing that gives the possibility of forgiveness and sacrifice. That's what I like about Julie Resch, because she acknowledges that these are the only things that actually allow forgiveness and self-sacrifice to even be real and true and actual. Because the moment you become self-interested in sacrifice, then it's not sacrifice anymore. It's like the ironic thing that happens over again. And if you're doing forgiveness for your own self-interestedness, then it's not forgiveness anymore. So there has to be a kind of dying, a kind of self-destruction. So yeah, I would agree with all that.
That was beautiful. Well, it just makes me think of, apparently Kafka was hilarious. Like, people love Kafka. He'd laugh, he'd cry. He's such a great guy. Like, some of the people that are like the darkest were actually like great. And there's some sort of revelation there, right? Like, you got all these people, like, why are all these Christians so happy? They're talking about the world ending and death and sin and all that different stuff. There's some sort of irony, and it makes me think, if I were to be playful, like, based on Wittgenstein. So death is not a thing in life. Life is death. So that means death is life. Because, so there's some sort of like, death is not a thing in life. Maybe we'll put it this way. Death is not a thing in life. Life is effacement. So death is life.
Yeah.
So, this is the situation. Like, death is actually not in life. Life is effacement. So that actually means death is life. And so that's the kind of move you have to at all times keep in mind, that keeps you then choosing in a manner that qualitatively changes yourself, that then changes how the world unfolds, et cetera, in terms of an absolute idealism, et cetera, so forth. Javier, I have to run. This was so intimate and cute. We got to have a date with Javier and Michelle. It was so wonderful. So Javier, thank you for coming on.
Hey, like one last thing. I'd be curious what you think about this. This idea that most of them define death drive as repetition compulsion. I think there's a way to look at absolute choice like that. It is repetition compulsion, where we constantly repeat our traumatic death of making a choice.
Sure.
I think there's, but yeah, other than that, I really enjoyed this talk, guys. It was really great.
It was wonderful. I think the issue is, like, is it possible that death drive 99% of the time is that repression repulsion, until ironically you take seriously the death drive, which then leads to a kind of Alex Ebert, where it's full out, it's exhausted, what's the term, where it's like saturated, fully saturated,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that actually creates a new equilibrium, where then then the repetition becomes the choice making. It moves from stuck in a situation you can't get out of, to then being externalized to having to keep making choices. But that requires the taking fully seriously the death drive, thus saturating it into a new equilibrium. Which then, of course, the question is, because of the divide between ideas and experiences, it seemed like that would require certain experiences to get there. But this is where it's weird, because you then would have to choose to fully saturate the death drive before you experience that saturation, thus leap of faith. You have to have a faith that would occur if you take it seriously. And this is all the ironic ontological situation we find ourselves in, that is why so many religious traditions have this public hysteric split. You only believe in God when God is dead. Like, you don't, like, you only the atheist can be the theist, all these weird paradoxes. It all becomes clear why these paradoxes are the case once you get the split between ideas and experiences, and the fact that deepest ontology is a situation of a broken entity. That then, if it's a broken entity, it's not broken, because it is that. What does that mean? And then, and then the unfolding and the creation, etc. So, but anyway, Javier, you're great. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. I like the hat that said real. That was perfect. Thanks. So that was good. That was really great. Bye, Javier. Thank you, sir.
All right, bye.
Have a good one. All the best.